Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another webinar from the YouNDigital project on young people, news and digital citizenship that is based at Lusófona University in Portugal and that is financed by the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology. Today, we have the pleasure to welcoming the researcher and also professor Ranjana to do a talk about what does local news use have to do with rising children. Let me also tell you that Ranjana is a senior lecturer in media and communication in Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey in UK. Her current work centers on parenting and technology with a particular focus on health and well-being. She is interested as well in empirical and conceptual explorations of people's everyday engagement with media and evolving communication technologies. She is the coordinator of two financed research projects and recently launched her new book on parents talking algorithms. So, Ranjana, once again, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me, and thanks for that very kind introduction, all of which was right, except my position. I am a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey, but thank you very much for having me. So what I'm going to do is present some findings today from my ongoing project funded by the Leverhulme Trust. Right, so this study is currently exactly 50% done. It's halfway through. And it's at the University of Surrey, where I'm based. And I'm doing this project with my co-investigators, Thomas Roberts, Emily Setti, and our postdoctoral colleague, Nerina Bursino. So anything that I do present today is very much collaborative work done jointly with them. So the overall project, which I suppose relates to your project, is about parents' news use and the relationships between news consumption and raising children. And the project has a particular focus on risks and crises in the news. But today I'm going to focus on something quite specific, which is the role of local news in parents' lives. So this is part of a broader study on news use. So the project itself aims to look at parents' engagement with risks and crises in the news. And there are two case studies nested inside the project. So one case study is to do with news about the climate and about the environmental crisis. And the other case study is to do with news about young people and young people's relationships and well-being, and particularly news coverage about young people and their online lives. So we are trying to find out how parents engage with the news. And I suppose I wanted to stop here a bit and add that obviously in the many, many decades of news use research, researchers have spoken to people who are parents. So that's not new. Rather, what we are interested in is approaching people as news users in their parental roles. So it's not as though nobody has ever spoken to people who have children, but rather we are placing front and center people's parenting roles and approaching parents in relation to the news. And then we are interested in the role of news in parents' lives, in parenting, raising children, making decisions about children, in conversations inside and outside the family home, inside parents' social circles, their broader networks as parents, and so on. So that's where that focus emerges on parenting and the news. We are particularly interested in how news use links to parents' decision-making and choices, parents' hopes, fears, and anxieties about their children's futures, and where news sits in relation to that. And how parents make sense of truth and trust and risk and responsibility when they engage with the news. And a related focus that's sort of emerging in the process, although that wasn't quite intended, is how parents mediate these and negotiate these with their children. So, for example, how parents talk about the news to their children, and we cover a wide age range. We have parents with toddlers who are not even in school yet, right up to parents of much older teenagers. Parents often want to talk to us about the news in terms of how they talk about the news to their children and their different policies around the news in their family. And of course, it goes without saying that a lot of this also intersects with their technology policies in their home around using digital devices, for example. So it sits at the project sits at the center, at the intersections of numerous really interesting conversations. And some of the frameworks we have been working with include, I suppose, we are sort of straddling sociology and communications in a way. So from sociology, there's a very developed scholarship on parenting in risk societies, parental anxiety about children's futures, particularly. And there's a lot of literature about sort of intensive parenting and intensive mothering, and a lot of parental vigilance and proactive risk mitigation to raise children. And there's a very well-developed literature within the sociology of parenting about sort of parenting and risks. I mean, even within communication studies, I mean, those of you who have read Sonny Livingstone and Alicia Blumross's book, Parenting for Digital Futures, will know how they sort of approach parents' conversations with their children about technology in the context of risk societies and in the context of sort of mitigating against real and perceived risks, and how parents sort of balance risks and opportunities. So there's that strand of work in communications as well around parenting and anxiety and children's futures. And then, of course, from communication and journalism studies particularly, there is obviously a very long history of news research and journalism research, and a perhaps slightly shorter history of research in active audiences and users of news and meaning making in terms of news. You see names there like Kim Schroeder and Brita Itrana and Halvard Moe, who have all been writing about how people engage with the news in a diversity of ways in what Schroeder calls the supermarket of news. And again, you see Itrana and Moe talking about sort of how people's engagement ranges from sort of monitoring to avoidance. And there's a big spectrum of ways in which people engage with the news. And there's also well-developed literature now on news and anxiety, news and well-being, the emotional dimensions of news, news fatigue, news avoidance, and all of that. So I suppose we are trying in this project to bring together two very well-developed and rich bodies of scholarship. The one, as I said, from within parenting sociology and parents' risk management and parents' parental anxiety on the one hand, and then news use. And the two don't very often interact or intersect, but there's such common grounds, right, for them to intersect around, when you look at risks or crises or anxiety, hopes and worries about the future. There are fertile grounds for cross-fertilization, which was the whole premise of our application for funding in the first place. So we knew that there was really fertile grounds for cross-fertilizing in these areas. And of course, for this particular talk today I'm going to have a very specific focus on local news. So the role of local news in people's lives, in parents' lives particularly. And again, here there is a well-developed literature on local journalism, for example, how local news fosters community trust and identity, community engagement. And there's a big debate about what is local news. Because, it could include traditional journalism, local social media outlets, user-generated content. And in our work on the local here, we've been sort of very much guided by our participants. So sometimes our participants wanted to talk to us about local newspapers. Sometimes they'd want to talk to us about local news groups, so groups and community groups where people would share news about the community. And they cast a really wide net, from leaflets and flyers through the door to local physical newspapers that you might pick up, to groups and newsletter communication from things like schools or other community organizations. So it was a very wide umbrella people cast. over what they defined as local news, and we've sort of gone with that. So this is a paper that's currently in progress, and we are taking our lead from our participants and defining local news quite broadly. So in terms of methodology, we are working with 30 parents from 30 different households from a very diverse socio-demographic area of sort of Greater London, Surrey and Hampshire, which is in the southeast of England. And the core methodology here is longitudinal. So instead of interviewing people once, we go back to people 3 times. And each time we speak to them in one-on-one in-depth sessions, we do something slightly different. So in the first round, the material from which I will present today, we went to people's homes largely, and we spent time with them inside their homes, talking about the role of the news in their lives in general, talking about sort of news in their lives growing up in their own childhoods when they were children, news used in the family home, general news and general risks and crises that they can think about in relation to the news. And then, of course, a specific focus on the case studies. And particularly also, we have significant strands on the role of technology, and particularly datafication and algorithmic personalization in news consumption. In the second round, which we are just finishing now, this week, actually, we have spoken to them again. And this time we have spoken to them online, where we have often shared our own screen of key headlines that have occurred in the last few months since we spoke. It has been an eventful few months. So in the UK, after we did round 1, in the UK, there were massive riots in the summer against migrants and people of color, many of whom felt very anxious and threatened by the riots. And this has also in parallel sort of happened around the incidents on Twitter, currently called X, where the owner of Twitter actively commented during the UK riots and platformed key far-right, extreme far-right activists. Then, of course, we have seen elections in the UK, which has seen a big change in government from the Conservatives to Labour. We have seen the US presidential elections with the sweeping victory of Donald Trump. But also there has been the crisis in the Middle East. There has been the situation between Russia and Ukraine. So a variety of things have happened since round 1. So in round 2, we've gone back to some of the issues they have raised from round 1, but also sort of screen shared various headlines and stories, and kind of try to draw out people's thoughts on the last few months, but also gone quite in depth into specific stories around our 2 case studies, which is the climate crisis and young people. So in relation to the climate crisis, the happening case studies in the news in the UK relate to the ultra low emission zone and charges placed on drivers driving into the zone, and vast spread reports of sewage emptying into rivers. And on the young people's case study, there has been a big conversation around banning smartphones for children in the UK in schools, and then broader debates, perhaps mirroring Australia, around compulsory age verification for children on social media. So these are the recent news stories we have looked at in round 2. And then round 3 is going to happen later in March 2025, and it'll be preceded by a WhatsApp-based diary study. So just before the final round of interviews, our participants will take part in a diary exercise. But today I'm going to talk about the first round. Unsurprisingly, for a study in the southeast of England, the vast majority of participants are white British, and then there is a significant minority of participants from other ethnic backgrounds. So today I'm going to spend a little bit of time thinking about key dimensions of local news in parents' lives. This was not, when we started out, it was not going to be a key focus. It wasn't going to be, it wasn't really on our radar as something particular that we were particularly interested in, but it became very evident when we were talking to parents that they wanted to talk to us about the local. So we started to untangle why people wanted to talk to us about the local so much, and why, what function the local served in their lives as news users. So today I'm going to talk about sort of 4 dimensions of local news use in parents' lives as an anchor to the local community, as a lens through which to interpret and view global and international and big picture issues, as an escape from overwhelmingly difficult, emotionally draining news, and as a site of labor that is part and parcel of parenting labor that is sometimes, although importantly, not always, gendered. So in our strand, which looks at local news as an anchor, we look at the local news acting as sort of community connections for parents raising their children within specific local and regional contexts. So for example, here we have Thalbir, who's a father of color, who talks to me at length about his experiences as a British person of color, and especially his experiences in round 2. He spoke about his experiences of the riots that happened in the summer. And he talks about following local news a lot. He talks about following multiple sources of news, but particularly news on Instagram and local groups on Instagram, because it makes him sort of rooted to his community. He feels things are more credible. And he relies many times, he drives a truck up and down the country. And as he drives to many places that are not at all local, it is periodically checking in when he stops on his social media, finding out about what's happening in his local community. That appears to act as a bit of an anchor for him. And I would just like to add from round 2, although this is not part of my slides, I just interviewed Thalbir on Friday. Today is Monday. I spoke to him on Friday evening, so just 2 or 3 days ago in round 2. And he was speaking to me about these riots that happened since we last spoke and how worried and anxious they made him feel, because his children are half Asian and half Hungarian, and that they are preparing in some ways to leave if things get really bad in the UK, and they're considering leaving the UK. And in that context of feeling profoundly scared or profoundly worried about his children's futures, in the context of these riots and crises, he tells me how important these local groups are in kind of sort of anchoring him to the community. The second strand of findings relates to local news as a lens. This was really important for us, and something all 4 of us on the study, doing our 4 separate groups of interviews, we would come back and we would all say, well, this happened, isn't that interesting? And we'd all say the same thing. And every time we tried talking to parents about big picture, sort of what you would call big items, like, you know, large scale global stories, whether it's geopolitical violence or the climate crisis, environmental change, big things, people would always interpret that and speak to us about that in relation to news about their local area. So, for example, when speaking about news around young people and children, many people talk to us about their locality, and for example, particularly knife crime. So Tracy says, I'll follow the stuff that's happening around London with knife crime to make sure my children are aware of the dangers, because my son has to go to school and he has to cross that lock over Teddington to go. Very specific geographical routing in a very particular space and place. And this wasn't the only example of that, of course, because there were loads of examples where we talked to people about environmental change, and they talked to us about news to do with recycling in their local community. We talked to people about sort of broader geopolitical crisis, and they would talk about their local news about policies in their locality that might affect their bin collections or their or the local school. And instead of dismissing this as trivial or somehow trivializing big things, I think we need to understand this as how people connect to big things. So people use the local as a lens to connect to those big things that we want to talk to them about. So it's all very good to say, we are going into this project to talk to people about large-scale crises, and perhaps feel slightly disappointed when you come away and think, well, yeah, they still talk to us about this leaflet about local recycling initiatives, but it's not disappointing. It is not disappointing because what people are telling us really is that the local news about their locality and news that is more local and more proximate is one of the ways in which parents connect to the big and to the global. And for parents particularly, because remember, we are approaching people in their parenting roles, that lock over Teddington, that point on the map, that bend in the street, that malfunctioning street light in the night when your young daughter is returning home from school for the first time, local news finds meaning in very specific ways then, where that broken lamp or that incidence of knife crime or something that happened in the local hospital is enormously important as a lens into these broader issues. So this particular aspect of the findings became really evident across all our interviews and became quite interesting for all of us. Now, much has been written about sort of the emotional dimensions of news fatigue, news avoidance, news anxiety, disconnection, and so on. And I'm fascinated by all these studies. And that's why our finding around sort of engaging with local news as a bit of an escape was quite interesting, because sometimes people talked about being overwhelmed. And many times parents said that, well, this is too much. I can't, I'm so impacted by what's going on in Ukraine or what's going on in the Middle East. I can't engage with it anymore. I'm going to switch that off. But then talk to us quite a lot about sort of more contained, localized things in relation to their children. So environmental change was a big one where this happened, where many people either were overwhelmed at the scale of the problem or were in despair at what governments might do, but then wanted to speak to us about local news, about local initiatives, about local green initiatives, local zero carbon music venues. So Charlie, for example, says, I'm aware of local Facebook groups which share posts from other businesses, news about green initiatives. There's a sound lounge down the high street, which is zero carbon, completely zero carbon music venue. So many of these people, when they talk to us about the local, were also people who told us in the context of the broader interview, more broadly, that this is too much. The overall is too much. I spoke to Helen last week in round 2, and she was really disillusioned about the climate after the election victory of Donald Trump. And she articulated quite clearly to me how she found it completely pointless and overwhelming when big news about climate change arrives at her doorstep. And again, local initiatives feel like something concrete, something you can actually do, something material, something you can act on. And so there was a lot of that in terms of local news as an escape. And the fourth and final strand of the findings, I suppose, is where we look at sort of local news management, news monitoring, acting on local news, following local news, keeping on top of local news, as part and parcel of parenting labor. And this is sometimes, although not always, gendered. So we found many mothers worrying about local news or anxious about the local, and thinking about scenarios to do with what if knife crimes continues to worsen when my child is much older? So my child is only 4 or 5 now, but I know in 10 years' time, this is going to be a worry. And Clarissa says here that, she uses Nextdoor for her news in terms of getting updates about people's cats gone missing or cars broken into and so on. And, that worry about, is that going to happen to us as well? And we found quite a number of mothers worrying about local news, which ties in quite significantly, we think, to long established debates around maternal anxiety and sort of intensive mothering and sort of gendered impetuses on mothers to mother intensively. But we also wanted to point out that local news use or engagement with the local news is not necessarily gendered. So we had quite a few fathers who made this distinction quite clear to us when they said that, well, we used to have a very wide spectrum of news engagement and news use, but ever since we became a parent, ever since I became a dad, I'm now more interested in the local. So there's that interesting dimension there, where local news is a site of parenting labor in general as people become parents, it seems, and it takes some monitoring, some sharing of notes across WhatsApp groups. Have you seen this? Have you seen that? Did you see this? Did you read that? Following local news groups, so parenting and monitoring and preparing in relation to local news is very much we thought, a side of labor, part of parenting labor. But the gender dimensions of that are quite interesting, where we found that maternal anxiety about the local news was really evident. But that this doesn't go to say that fathers were not engaged with local news, because many of them reported being sort of more engaged ever since they became a father. So I suppose what we are arguing is that within that umbrella of that broader study, where we are approaching people as news users in their parenting roles particularly, we found, quite surprisingly to us, because this wasn't a sort of a pre-decided strand of the project in any way, that local news has an important role to play in parental decision-making, even when this is not explicitly recognized. And that these dimensions can appear to be standalone, but they're not watertight. And the same parent might go through sort of different phases when their child is, say, 2 versus when their child is 16. Or the same parent might align with a particular stance more in one aspect of their role. So, for example, a migrant parent might feel that local news anchors herself, anchors her in the local community in a certain way, and that's meaningful for her as a migrant parent, but might also be using local news as an escape or a lens in relation to another issue, for example. So these are not watertight dimensions, and they depend very much on people's life context and the changing nature of parenting. It isn't static. It isn't static by person, but it also isn't static by in terms of parenting itself, because parenting goes through all these stages and your stances change. And it also isn't static in relation to sort of issues. It's not as though you use all local news along that one dimension for all issues. So you might have different approaches and different stances based on what issue it is that you are engaging with. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that is quite how wide that umbrella was in terms of what is local news, because people did not define it as local journalism alone. It was a lot of word of mouth. It was leaflets, flyers, local groups, community groups, and these again were not overlapping categories. Sometimes people would share links to local journalism on these groups and between themselves on WhatsApp. So there are interesting networks in terms of how news about the local spreads between parents and inside parent networks. So on that note, I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Ranjana, for this amazing presentation. We are now opening for the debate, and I will start asking if anyone has questions or comments.
Yes.
Lucia, please go ahead.
Yes, Ranjana, thank you so much for your presentation. And I followed some of it in ICREA, so in the pre-conference of ICREA, so it was great to hear again. And I just wanted to clarify a little bit on your dimensions. So you suggested as the name of this dimension, escape, using yeah, so, but while you were explaining to us this specific dimension, you also talked about actions that people use the local news or the local activities within community to express themselves and to kind of avoid the anxiety of big issues by acting. So I don't know if there is a possibility to understand a little bit how this resonates as audience, for instance, engagement or audience responses, because if it is directly related to local news, maybe worth it making kind of a dedicated, I don't know, some data that you could give us some ideas about it, you know, because this is a very important part on journalism studies and audience studies, is how people receive their news and how they act on it and how they respond, what their response regarding the news, you know, what to do with the news that they receive, you know. So I don't know if there is a possibility for it or...
Yeah, so I suppose 2 examples come to mind. So I'll talk about Beatrice, for example, who's a mother who found the coverage of Ukraine or Gaza profoundly upsetting. And she said that she rarely makes it through a full broadcast because she says that the weight of these global issues are too much, and that it makes her think, how safe are we for how long? But then she very quickly in the conversation itself spoke at length about the local. For example, monitoring local crime rates or getting involved with local, seemingly smaller scale matters. And this happened with quite a few other people. I can also think of Helen, for example, who was another mother we spoke to, who pointed out to me the differences inside the family. So she said her partner was what she described as defeatist because he was so overwhelmed with large-scale political issues and large-scale war and deprivation and poverty. And for her, it was a conscious decision in some ways about, I'm not him. I'm not like him. I'm going to focus on practical, actionable information. And one of the ways in which this becomes really clear, it's not as though she isn't political, but she talked about the political to us through the lens of the local. For example, with the elections, she wasn't particularly keen to talk about the big picture issues about the Labour and Conservatives in the country, but talk about specifically the very local election for police and crime commissioner and the need for better lighting in the roads around her house so that it is safer for women. And then she said, that's why I voted for the police and crime commissioner. So it was almost a distanciation from the big and the global, but then a reconnection to the local. And for Helen, we found that sort of local news offered that sense of agency, because following the news, following information about the local election, the local police commissioner, the local lighting, local streets, and deciding not to do what husband is doing, which is feeling profoundly upset about very, very difficult things in the news, had become almost an agentic practice in some ways, although it presents on the surface, I'll accept, as some kind of distanciation or giving up or overwhelm or disconnection. But actually, in the middle of there, you can see some kind of agency in terms of dealing with more manageable news, if you see what I mean.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I understand. I'm gonna leave the floor for other questions, but anyway, I can ask later.
Thank you.
Again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lucia and Ranjana. Any more questions or comments? Mariana, go ahead.
Hello, I have a very specific one. Firstly, thank you so much, Ranjana. I think your study is very insightful and important. I have a very specific question regarding during your interviews, you were able to stay alone with the parents, or children were together in some moments, and how this worked?
We have largely been alone, because usually either the children have been at school, or they have been, if they are too small, they have been in childcare, or if it has been in an evening, the other parent would have been looking after them. And I suspect it would have been quite different with the children around, because there are distressing topics to do with the news that are talked about. So no, children were largely not there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my curiosity was related with these specific topics that could be not very easy to talk about it with your children around. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana and Ranjana, once again. So let's move on to a final question or comment. Someone, Maria José? Yes, please.
So first, thank you so much, Ranjana, for this inspiring research. These are just well, general questions, and you can see which one of them you might want to answer. The first one would be more on the, if you could elaborate on the you're identifying, as far as I remember, walking interviews, if you could talk a bit more about it and how that relates with, let's say, the more formal way of doing interviews that is also a part of the project, as far as I understood. And then if you could talk a bit more about the gender perspective inside of your study, namely in relation to the mothers.
So walking interviews were a possibility that we have considered, and we could still consider for the final round, but we haven't used them so far because it turns out that it is more productive for parents to be able to show us bits of news and for us to be able to show parents bits of news. So that was definitely something we discovered, that it's quite useful to actually be able to screen share or to show little things which might not necessarily be possible in a walking interview. But also we want to reduce the practical burdens on our parents. And very often these people are very, very busy balancing work and life. So we haven't decided if we are going to use them in round 3. We may or we may not, we don't quite know. In terms of the gendered dimension, yes, like we said, that there appears to be a link. I use the word link loosely because this is a qualitative project, between maternal anxiety and maternal labor in relation to decision making and sort of future proofing for their children, which is well evidenced in sociology, and sort of mothers worrying about the news. And it's important that we locate that in context. So if there is a broader societal imperative for women to mother intensively and to sort of, we have to understand that maternal anxiety are in that context. But I'm also keen to avoid so we are not trying to say that engagement with local news is entirely maternal or entirely gendered in that way, because lots of fathers spoke to us about that transitional point. Me and some colleagues have recently published a paper about these sort of transitional moments in parenting where, there are big transitions like divorce or death or something dramatically big. But sometimes there are small transitions, like a child gets a diagnosis and has a disability diagnosis, or a child is going through a period of short, contained illness. And becoming a parent is a big life transition. And quite a few fathers spoke to us about sort of that becoming a parent, that transition, in some ways attuning them to the local. A lot of fathers, fairly unprompted, for example, told us, well, then I became a parent, and then you see, so many things changed in my life, but this is one thing that changed. So I would say perhaps that maternal anxiety about the news, we found sort of quite maternal in that sense and worthy of investigation. But also simultaneously, engagement with local news appeared to be shaped by becoming a parent, or your child is now a teenager and no longer holds your hand and goes to school. Your child is now walking to school. Your child is taking the bus, and suddenly you are more interested in the streetlights, or you're more interested in the local crime rate in a different way than you were 10 years ago. So both those things, I'd say.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question or a comment? Teresa? Yes.
If no
please,
one
go ahead.
wants to. Hi, Ranjana. It was lovely to hear you again about this subject. Congratulations. I would like to ask you if parents talked about, for instance, when news come to them, to the children, to the family environment, of how they deal with explaining or mediating the news for the children, their children.
Yeah, and this is really interesting. This also emerged as a sort of unintended focal point in round 1, and definitely has persisted through round 2. And I suppose we haven't really analyzed findings around how parents talk about the news to their children, so I cannot give you general findings. I can only share with you sort of illustrative, anecdotal accounts from my understanding so far. And it seems that it's it's a strange line to walk for parents between, on the one hand, the desperate desire to protect children, including things like completely not switching news channels on or switching television off when the child is around, or not discussing with their husbands or wives certain issues. So there's that, especially about distressing things, but also wanting to get ahead of the playground gossip, of them hearing things from other people. And the recent riots in the UK were particularly interesting in that regard, because when I spoke to parents, they were both, on the one hand, preventing their child from seeing distressing things or hearing about distressing things, but on the other hand, also talking to their child in their own way, with almost themselves as the gatekeepers and editors of what's going on. And particularly the one example that's been on my mind for the last few days is Talbir, like I said, who I spoke to on Friday night. And he said something that I'm sure is going to come up in our papers as a quote, because he said he has 2 9-year-old twins and a baby. So the baby doesn't understand, but the 9-year-old twins, who are half Asian with an Asian dad, when he tried to talk to the riots, talk about the riots to them, he said on the one hand, he didn't let them watch anything. He didn't want them to see the coverage of anything. But he said, I had to explain to my children why daddy can't leave the house because daddy is too worried about going and buying some milk. And to explain to them that this is our country, but some people don't like the way we look. And you could see that he was trying to both share the news with them to prepare them, but also not share the news with them to protect them. And I think that encapsulates that line that parents are trying to walk constantly.
Thank you, Ranjana.
Thank you. And thank you, Ranjana, once
That's
again.
okay.
And
Thank you for having me.
congratulations on your
was a
work. I will put on the chat the project YouTube playlist, and after that we will put this webinar on this playlist. So
Thank you.
So much,
just
Ranjana.
Cool. Thank you very much for having me, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.